The morning Cecelia Voss arrived in Dusthaven, Texas, the whole town smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, and the first thing she saw was a little boy crying in the dirt outside the general store with no shoes on his feet. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kishom Trail had seen better days. The cattle drive still thundered through the flat, sun-baked land of central Texas, with enough frequency that the air never fully cleared of trail dust, and towns like Dusthaven existed in that peculiar in-between state, not quite civilized, not quite wild, just alive in the way that a fire is alive when it's burning down to its last good coal. The town had a main street of packed earth, a livery, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on the first Tuesday of every month, a small schoolhouse that only had a teacher when a teacher could be found, and a general store owned by a widow named Harriet Coombs who trusted almost no one and extended credit to even fewer. There was a church with a crooked steeple, a telegraph office that received more bad news than good, and a doctor who was better at pulling teeth than setting bones. That was Dusthaven. That was the world Cecelia Voss stepped into when the stagecoach ground to a halt, and the driver said, flatly, "End of the line, ma'am," as though he was apologizing for something larger than the journey itself. Cecelia was 24 years old, with dark brown hair pinned beneath a dusty travel bonnet and green eyes that had not yet decided whether the world deserved their full attention. She was not a small woman, but she was not large either. She was the kind of woman who filled a room not with her size but with the quality of her stillness, as though she were always listening for something just beneath the surface of ordinary sound. She had come from Missouri, from a town called Grayling where the soil was good, but the prospects for a woman without family were not. Her mother had died 2 winters past from a fever that should not have taken her. Her father had died the previous autumn from stubbornness, which was a condition that Cecelia privately believed killed more men than any disease. She had no siblings. She had a small trunk, $23, and a letter of introduction to a rancher named Thomas Hale, who had placed an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette, requesting a housekeeper of good moral character and strong constitution to manage the domestic affairs of his household. 2 children included, salary negotiable, room and board provided. The advertisement had not mentioned that Thomas Hale was a widower of only 8 months. It had not mentioned that the 2 children were a 6-year-old boy named Samuel and a 4-year-old girl named Clara, and that both of them had been more or less fending for themselves since their mother died, because Thomas Hale was a man who knew everything there was to know about cattle and almost nothing about grief. And the 2 of them had collided inside him with a force that had left him somewhere between numb and broken. It had not mentioned any of that, but Cecelia figured these things out quickly enough, because the little boy crying in the dirt outside Harriet Coombs' general store was Samuel Hale, and when Cecelia crouched down beside him in her travel-worn skirt and asked him what was wrong, he looked up at her with eyes that were the precise deep brown of good saddle leather and said, "I lost the coin Papa gave me for crackers and Clara's hungry, and I can't find it anywhere." Cecelia looked at him for a moment. She reached into the small coin purse tucked inside her travel bag, and she produced a nickel. "Then let us go in together and get those crackers," she said, "and afterwards you can show me where your papa's ranch is, because I believe I am supposed to be working for him." Samuel stared at her. "Are you the new housekeeper?" "I am," she said. "Papa said you probably wouldn't come," Samuel said. "He said most ladies read the advertisement and then think better of it." "Your papa was not wrong about most ladies," Cecelia said, "but I am not most ladies. Now come on. Your sister is hungry." She bought the crackers, and Samuel walked her to the Hale ranch as though he had always been doing it, talking the entire way about a horse named Biscuit who could almost count to 3, and a coyote he had seen drinking from the creek that was almost certainly magical. Cecelia listened to every word. The Hale Ranch sat about 2 miles south of Dusthaven proper, close enough to town to not feel entirely isolated, but far enough that, when the wind came across the plains, It came without interruption, full and warm and smelling of grass and livestock, and the particular dry sweetness of Texas in spring. The house was a solid frame structure, white paint gone gray, with a good front porch and a kitchen garden that had clearly been tended with real love at some point in the past and was now going slowly to seed. There were fences, well maintained. There were cattle in the north pasture, a number she estimated at close to 300 head. There was a bunkhouse set back from the main house where two ranch hands lived, a lean older man named Walt and a younger, quieter one named Pedro who tipped his hat to her without making a thing of it, which she appreciated. And there was Thomas Hale. He was standing at the fence post nearest the barn when she came up the road with Samuel trotting ahead, and she had a moment to look at him before he looked at her. He was 30 years old, tall in the way that working men are tall, not decorative but functional, with broad shoulders that had been shaped by years of actual labor and dark hair that had gone a little long for want of a barber, and a jaw that carried the kind of stubble that accumulates when a man has stopped noticing his own reflection. He was not a classically handsome man, but he was a striking one, the way that certain landscapes are striking, not because they are beautiful in any conventional sense, but because they are so entirely and uncompromisingly themselves. He had the same deep brown eyes as his son, and when he turned and saw Cecelia walking up the road with Samuel beside her and a paper bag of crackers in her hand, something moved across his face that she could not quite name. It was not surprise, exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who has braced himself for an impact that has not, in the end, come from the direction he expected. "You are Miss Voss," he said. "I am," she said. "You are Mr. Hale." "I am," he said. They looked at each other for a moment across the distance that remained between them, which was about 10 yards and also, in some less measurable sense, considerably more than that. "Samuel tells me your daughter Clara is at the house," she said. "I'd like to meet her, and if you'll show me the kitchen I can start supper." Thomas Hale looked at her for another moment. "You don't want to see your room first. The terms haven't even been discussed." "The terms can wait," Cecelia said. "Children can't." He opened his mouth as though he intended to say something, then closed it again and nodded. Clara was in the house when Cecelia came in, sitting on the floor of the front room with a cloth doll clutched to her chest, looking up with the particular careful expression of a child who has learned not to be too hopeful about things. She had her mother's red gold hair, which Cecelia learned later from a photograph on the mantel, and she had her father's stubborn jaw, and she had the eyes of neither of them, gray-green like a sky before weather. She was 4 years old, and she had not been sleeping well for 8 months, and the shadows under her eyes made Cecilia's chest tight in a way she had not been prepared for. "Hello," Cecelia said, sitting down on the floor next to her without ceremony. "My name is Cecelia. I have come to help your papa take care of things around here, and I think Samuel has crackers if you want one." Clara looked at her with those serious storm-colored eyes. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. "The last one didn't stay." "What happened to the last one?" Cecelia asked, keeping her voice easy. "She said it was too lonely," Clara said. Cecelia looked around the front room, the dusty curtains, the photograph on the mantel, the small collection of children's things scattered across the floor, the general atmosphere of a house that was still trying to be a home and not quite managing it. "I grew up lonely," she said. "This does not frighten me." Clara considered this for a long moment with the gravity of a small judge. Then she held out the cloth doll. "Her name is Margaret," she said. "You can hold her while Samuel gets the crackers." Cecelia held Margaret the doll very carefully and felt something settle into place in her chest, like a key in a lock. The kitchen was a disaster, but an honest one, not dirty so much as overwhelmed, the kind of disorder that happens when someone is trying their best and the best is not quite enough. There was flour in the wrong canisters and coffee that had gone stale, and a half-empty jar of molasses that had crusted over at the lid. The iron stove was good, though, a solid, heavy-gauge piece that held heat properly, and the pantry had the bones of a workable larder once she organized it. She made corn porridge and salt pork for supper that night because those were the ingredients that were reliably on hand, and she set the table for 4 without being asked. Thomas Hale ate supper with his children. She had not been sure he would. She had half expected the kind of remote, isolated grief that keeps a man apart. But he sat down at the head of the table and helped Clara cut her food and listened while Samuel talked about the possibly magical coyote. And if there was a hollowness in him, a place where someone used to sit that was now empty, he was managing it with a kind of dignified steadiness that she found herself respecting before she fully understood that she respected it. "This is good," he said of the porridge. He said it simply, not as a compliment designed to impress her but as a plain statement of fact, the way a man says something is good when he has not eaten a proper meal in longer than he wants to admit. "Thank you," she said. "Where did you learn to cook?" "My mother," she said. "She believed that food was how you showed people you cared about them." He nodded slowly. "My wife felt the same," he said, and then there was a silence that she did not try to fill, because some silences are not meant to be filled. She slept that night in a small room off the kitchen with a good bed and a window that looked east, and she lay awake for a while listening to the vast quiet of the Texas plains, the distant sound of cattle, the far-off call of a night bird, the creak of the house settling around her, and thought that her mother would have said this was a place that was waiting for something. She was not sure yet what that something was, but she thought she could probably be useful in the meantime, which was, when all was said and done, the best reason she knew for being anywhere. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that real domestic work is busy, not the grand, dramatic busy of some enormous task accomplished all at once, but the steady accumulating busy of 100 small things done properly every day. She organized the pantry and the kitchen. She mended the children's clothes and made note of what needed replacing. She established a routine for mealtimes and bedtimes, not rigidly but firmly enough that both children began to settle into it with the particular relief of small creatures who have been uncertain for too long about when the next reliable thing was coming. Samuel was an easy child to love, curious and talkative and generous with his trust in the way that some 6-year-olds are before the world has given them a reason not to be. He helped her in the kitchen garden, pulling weeds with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and told her everything he knew about every person in Dusthaven, which was a great deal and surprisingly accurate. He was the one who told her, in the matter-of-fact way of children, that his father didn't sleep well, that he heard him walking around the house at night sometimes, and that before his mother died his father used to whistle while he worked, and he didn't do that anymore. Clara was slower to open, but when she did it fully. It happened on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Cecelia arrived, when Clara woke before dawn with a bad dream and came padding into the kitchen in her nightgown to find Cecelia already up and starting the bread. Cecelia put her in a chair by the warm stove and gave her a cup of warm milk with a little honey in it, which had been Cecilia's own mother's remedy for nightmares, and she sat across from her and said, "Do you want to tell me what you dreamed?" Clara said, "I dreamed Mama came back but she couldn't see us. She walked right through us like we weren't there." Cecelia was quiet for a moment. "That sounds frightening," she said. "It was," Clara said. "Do you think she can see us, wherever she is?" "I think," Cecelia said carefully, "that the people who love us very much don't stop being able to see us just because they're not here anymore. I think love is probably the one thing that doesn't have trouble going through walls." Clara thought about this. "Like how light comes through the curtains even when they're closed." "Exactly like that," Cecelia said. Clara climbed down from her chair and came around the table and put her small head against Cecilia's arm, and Cecelia put her arm around her, and they sat like that by the warm stove, while the bread rose, and the darkness outside the window went gradually from black to the deep blue-gray of early morning, and neither of them said anything else for a while, but the quality of the silence between them had changed entirely. Thomas Hale saw all of this. He was not a demonstrative man, not by temperament, and not by the tradition of the time and place he lived in. Texas ranchers of 1878 were not generally men who spoke openly about what moved them. But he watched. He watched the way his children looked for Cecelia when she was not in the room, the way Samuel's chatter had taken on a new ease and confidence, the way Clara had started sleeping through the night again, the way both of them had begun to look more like children and less like small people carrying weight they had no business carrying. He watched the kitchen garden coming back to life under Cecilia's hands, straight rows of beans and squash and tomatoes where there had been nothing but tangle and waste for most of a year. He watched her move through the work of the house with a competence that had nothing performative about it, nothing that asked to be noticed, just the steady, focused energy of someone who knew what needed doing and did it. And on a morning in late April, about a month after she had arrived, he watched her feed his children before she fed herself. It was not a grand gesture. It was the smallest, most ordinary thing in the world. He had come in from the early morning rounds to find her at the stove, and Samuel and Clara were already at the table, and she was setting their plates down with the swift, practiced efficiency she always brought to the task. And when Samuel immediately knocked his cup sideways and the milk went across the table, she caught most of it with a dish cloth before it reached Clara, laughing a little at the speed of the thing. And she settled both children and made sure their plates were right, and their cups were refilled before she went back to the stove and poured a cup of coffee for herself, and finally, at last, sat down with her own plate. It was a small thing. It was a daily thing. It was the kind of thing that a woman in her position could be expected to do without it meaning anything beyond the practical. But Thomas Hale stood in the doorway of his kitchen and watched it happen and felt something in his chest shift with a slow, deep movement, like a loaded wagon wheel finding solid ground after a long stretch of mud. It was not a thought. It was not a decision. It was simpler and more certain than either of those things. It was recognition, the kind that lands before language does, before you have had time to be cautious or sensible about it. He did not say anything. He sat down and ate his breakfast and listened to Samuel's account of finding actual gold in the creek, which turned out to be a piece of fool's gold, but which Samuel was not yet willing to abandon as a theory. And he watched Cecelia add a spoonful of molasses to Clara's porridge when Clara asked for it. And he felt the shift in his chest settle into something quieter and more lasting, something that would take time to name properly. That evening, after the children were in bed, he found her on the front porch, sitting in the old wooden chair with a piece of mending in her lap, working by the light of the last of the sunset. He pulled the other chair out and sat down beside her. For a while neither of them said anything. The plains stretched out before them in the cooling gold of a Texas spring evening, the grass moving slow and easy in the wind, the cattle in the north pasture making the low, steady sounds that cattle make when everything is well enough. "You are good with them," he said finally. She looked up from her mending. "They are easy to be good with," she said. "They're good children." "They are," he said. "They weren't always this." He searched for the word and did not entirely find it. Clara had stopped talking much. After their mother died, she just stopped. "She talks to me now," Cecelia said. "I know," he said. "I hear her." He looked out at the plain. "I don't know what you did." "I sat with her," Cecelia said simply. "That's usually what it takes, just to have someone sit with you." He looked at her then, a direct look that she held without flinching, and she saw in his face the particular expression of a man who has been given something he did not know how to ask for. It was not quite vulnerability. He was not a man who wore vulnerability easily, but it was its close cousin, the kind of openness that lives just below the controlled exterior of a person who has been managing alone for too long. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I know it's not." He stopped. "I know the advertisement was not entirely candid." "About the children," she said. "About the circumstances," he said. "About my wife." She folded the mending in her lap. "Your son told me she died 8 months ago. I was sorry to hear it." He nodded. "Anna," he said, and the name had the particular weight of a name that someone has been careful not to say too often for fear of what happens when they do. She was the kind of woman who made everything work. I don't mean that I didn't do my part. I do my part on this land well enough. But she was the one who made the house into a house, a place that meant something. And when she was gone, I could keep the cattle and the fences, but I could not. He stopped again. Could not keep the warmth in it, Cecelia said. Yes, he said quietly. That is exactly it. She looked at him for a moment, and then she looked back out at the plain, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have established, without needing to announce it, that they can say real things to each other. I lost my mother 2 years ago and my father last fall, she said. No siblings, so I understand something about managing in an empty house. You do, he said. It was not a question. I do, she said. And I will tell you, Mr. Hale, that in my experience the house does not stay empty, not if you let people into it. He looked at her again. Thomas, he said. I'd prefer if you called me Thomas. Then you had best call me Cecelia, she said. The summer came on fast and hot the way Texas summers do, without apology and without gradation. 1 week it was pleasant, and then all at once it was the full-bore heat of June beating down on the flat land with the impartial intensity of a forge. The cattle work intensified. Thomas and Walt and Pedro were up before dawn most days, and often not back until the long summer dark. There was a stretch of 2 weeks in June when Thomas barely came in for supper because there was trouble with a section of the east fence, and 3 steers had gotten into bad water and needed watching. And during those 2 weeks, Cecelia ran the household entirely on her own, not with any resentment but with the practical competence of a woman who had always known how to make things work. She took Samuel to town with her for the weekly supply run on Saturdays, because he loved the social exercise of Dusthaven, and because she had found that giving him a small role, carrying the lighter packages, holding the horse, improved his behavior considerably, and made him feel important in the way that 6-year-old boys need to feel important. Clara usually stayed home with her dolls and her drawings. She had a genuine talent for drawing that Cecelia had discovered when she found a whole collection of careful little sketches under Clara's bed of horses, flowers, and faces. And Cecelia had bought her a proper drawing tablet with a few of her own wages, which had made Clara look at her with an expression of such transparent joy that Cecelia had to turn away for a moment to compose herself. On one of the Saturday supply runs in late June, she was in Harriet Coombs' store picking through the available dried beans when she became aware of a conversation happening just around the corner of the shelving between Harriet and a woman whose voice she didn't recognize. It's not proper, the unknown woman was saying, with the particular tone of someone enjoying their impropriety. A single woman living under that man's roof. Widow or no, people are talking. People always talk in Dusthaven, Harriet said flatly. Harriet was not Cecilia's greatest admirer, but she was a fair woman. I'm just saying what others are saying, the voice said. You're saying what you're saying, Harriet replied, and I'd suggest keeping it to yourself. Miss Voss is doing work that needs doing, and those children needed someone. The conversation moved on. Cecelia finished selecting her beans with the same steady attention she gave to everything. She was not naive about the social calculus of a small frontier town. She had known when she took the position that it would attract comment, and she had decided before she arrived that the work mattered more than the commentary. But she was human, and the conversation settled in her like a small splinter, not painful exactly, but present. She mentioned none of it to Thomas when he came in from the eastern pasture that evening, dusty and tired, and sat down to supper with his children, and ate the beef stew she had made with the kind of concentrated gratitude that a genuinely hungry man brings to a good meal. She did not mention it until a week later, when Thomas came to find her in the kitchen garden one Sunday afternoon, his one day of lighter work, and stood by the garden fence watching her stake the tomato plants with the strips of old cloth she'd cut from a worn sheet. "You're quiet today," he said. "I'm often quiet," she said. "You're differently quiet," he said. She looked up at him, slightly surprised that he had noticed the distinction. "I had some news from town," she said carefully. "Nothing I can't manage, but I thought you should be aware that people have been talking about the arrangement here, my being here under your roof." He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon sun was strong and he had his hat low over his eyes and she could not entirely read his expression. "I've heard some of it," he said. "And," she asked. "And it doesn't concern me," he said. "This is my house and my household and my children, and I conduct my affairs according to what is right and not according to what Dusthaven gossips think is right." "I know," she said. "But it might concern me, my reputation." He looked at her for a long moment. "Is it your intention to leave?" he asked, and there was something in the question that was more careful than its plain surface suggested. "No," she said honestly, "it is not." "Then I will handle the talk," he said. "How?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he said, simply, "There are ways to handle talk." And he picked up a spare length of cloth from the pile she was working from and handed it to her, and they did not speak of it again that afternoon. What he did was go to Harriet Coombs on the following Monday and purchase a length of good fabric and ask her, in front of several witnesses, to recommend it for a dress, describing in general terms a woman who preferred practical things but deserved something nicer. Harriet, who was sharper than most people gave her credit for, had looked at him for a long moment and said she thought it would suit very well. Fabric, a deep green wool that was not extravagant but was genuinely fine, arrived at the ranch in Thomas's saddlebag that evening, and he left it on the kitchen table with no note because he was not a man who wrote notes easily. But when Cecelia came into the kitchen the next morning and found it there, and turned to look at him over her shoulder, he met her eyes across the room with the quiet directness that was becoming familiar to her, and she did not need a note. "It's beautiful," she said. "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't need to," he said. She looked at the fabric for another moment, running her fingers across the weave. Then she said, "Thank you, Thomas." And there was something in the way she said his name that was different from how she had been saying it, something warmer and more deliberate, and he carried that all day out on the eastern pasture without examining it too closely, the way you carry a good thing carefully so you don't break it before you understand what it is. July arrived, and with it a heat that settled over the land like a hand pressed flat, and the work of the ranch went on, and the rhythm of the household deepened into something that felt less like an arrangement and more like a life. Cecelia began teaching Samuel his letters and numbers in the afternoons, because the schoolteacher position in Dusthaven had not been filled for the past 6 months, and someone had to do it, and she found she had a genuine talent for it. She could see the exact shape of the gap between what a child knew and what they were ready to learn, and walk them across it with a patience that came not from effort but from actual temperament. Samuel, who had seemed unlikely to sit still for learning, turned out to love numbers with a passion that surprised them both, and by the middle of July, he was doing simple sums with a focus he brought to nothing else except possibly the subject of magical coyotes. Clara was drawing horses that actually looked like horses, and Cecelia had mounted several of them on the wall of the front room with small tacks, and the house was beginning to look, from the inside, like the kind of place where people intended to stay. On an evening in late July, Thomas came home from the far pasture earlier than expected because a coming storm had chased him and Walt and Pedro in, and he found Cecelia in the kitchen making biscuits with both children perched on the counter beside her, Clara rolling a small scrap of dough with deep concentration, and Samuel engaged in the task of cutting the biscuits out with the tin cutter, his tongue poking from the corner of his mouth with effort. The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and butter and something sweet, and the storm light coming through the kitchen window was the particular electric gold that happens when thunder is building in a Texas sky. And the three of them were talking and laughing about something he had missed the beginning of, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and he felt it again, that shift in his chest, deeper this time, more certain, no longer surprising but no less powerful for that. He had loved Anna. He had loved her with the whole force of his character, which was considerable, and she had died 8 months ago, and the world had gone wrong in a way that he had been fairly sure was permanent. He had not expected this. He had not expected to come home to a kitchen that smelled like butter and storm light and feel the particular fullness of a man who has something to lose again. "Papa," Samuel said, catching sight of him, "I'm cutting the biscuits." "I see that," Thomas said, coming fully into the kitchen and hanging his hat on the hook by the door. "Those are fine-looking biscuits, son." Cecelia glanced over her shoulder at him, and he could see the flush from the warm stove on her face, her hair loose from its pins at the front, her hands floury to the wrist. "Storm coming," she said. "About an hour out," he said. "Good thing, too, the creek was getting low." "The garden could use it," she said, and then to Clara, "Easy with the rolling pin, sweetheart, you don't want to make it too thin." He sat down at the kitchen table and watched them finish the biscuits, and the storm broke about 40 minutes later with the theatrical force that Texas storms bring to bear. And they ate supper, while lightning illuminated the window glass in periodic bright sheets, and thunder rolled across the plain like something massive being moved in a distant room. And Samuel told an involved story about a dream in which Biscuit the horse could absolutely count to 5 actually, not just 3. He had miscounted before. And Clara fell asleep against Cecilia's arm before the meal was done and had to be carried to bed, which Thomas did. And when he came back downstairs, Cecelia was at the table with a cup of coffee, and the storm was still running hard outside, and the house was warm and full of the good smell of the meal. He sat down across from her. The lamp between them made the room feel close and particular, separate from the big wild dark outside. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it plainly." She looked at him across the lamp with her steady green eyes. "All right," she said. "Are you happy here?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet he could hear the storm on the roof, the good, steady rush of necessary rain. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am happier here than I have been anywhere since my mother was alive. And I did not entirely expect that." "Neither did I," he said, and she looked at him with a slight change of expression that acknowledged the weight of what he had just said. "I know this is a complicated situation," she said carefully. "I know you are not long out of your grief. I would not want you to think that I am—" She stopped, searching for the right words. "Presuming," he said. "Yes," she said, "I am not presuming anything." "I know you are not," he said. "That is one of the things He paused. "That is one of the things I appreciate about you." They looked at each other across the lamp in the warm kitchen while the storm did what storms do, and neither of them said anything more that night. But the air between them had changed again. It was different now, richer, carrying the weight of things acknowledged without yet being spoken. August brought the end of the drive season, and with it a different kind of busyness. The paperwork and accounting that Thomas hated but that had to be done. The negotiating with buyers that required him to be in town more often. The general assessment of the ranch's condition that preceded the fall. He brought Cecelia into some of these conversations, not deliberately at first, but because she was present and sharp, and he had noticed that her thinking was both practical and clear-eyed. And after the second time he found himself explaining a problem partly because her response genuinely helped him solve it. He stopped pretending it was incidental. She had a good head for numbers, which she attributed to her father's insistence on doing the household accounts herself from the age of 12. She could see where money was being wasted and where it was being wisely spent, and she said so without drama or self-congratulation, the way she did most things. Thomas started leaving the account books on the kitchen table when he had to go to town, not asking her to look at them but not asking her either, and she looked at them, and the notes she left beside them in her careful handwriting were consistently useful. One afternoon in mid-August, Pedro brought a stray dog back from the pasture, a rangy, nondescript creature with one ear higher than the other and the general demeanor of a dog that had learned not to trust anything too quickly, and both children immediately wanted to keep it. Thomas looked at the dog and then looked at Cecelia, whose expression was carefully neutral. "It is your house," she said. "Your opinion matters," he said. "I think a dog is a fine thing for children to have," she said, "and it looks like it could use a home." The dog, who was named Captain by Samuel after approximately 45 seconds of deliberation, turned out to be a useful ranch dog and an excellent children's dog, which are not always the same thing but which this dog managed to be simultaneously. He slept outside by day and on the porch by night, and within a week he had established that Samuel and Clara were his people and no one else's, which delighted both children enormously. Cecelia watched Thomas with the dog one evening, kneeling in the yard to let it examine his hand, speaking to it quietly, working his way into the animal's confidence with the same patient respect he gave to skittish horses. And she thought about what it meant to be a person who approached the world that way, with patience and with care. She thought about what it had taken him to put the advertisement in the Missouri Gazette, to ask for help in the plain-spoken terms he had used. A man who she suspected found asking for help one of the harder things. She thought about what it had cost him to be gracious to her from the beginning, to treat her as a capable person from the first day, to say thank you without awkwardness when she did something well. She thought about his children and the way they leaned toward him at the supper table, and the way he listened to Samuel's elaborate theories about the natural world with genuine attention, and the way he helped Clara practice her letters even on evenings when he was exhausted from the day. She was falling in love with him. She had known it for a while in some part of herself that ran ahead of her conscious understanding, but she knew it now clearly and whole, standing in the yard in the blue August evening watching a man make friends with a stray dog. And it was not a frightening knowledge exactly, but it was a weighty one, the kind of thing that changes the landscape you are moving through without changing the ground itself. She did not say anything about it. She was careful. She was practical. She understood that what she felt and what was appropriate to express were not necessarily the same thing, and she also understood that Thomas Hale was a man who had to make his own way to things, at his own pace, and that the worst thing she could do was rush him. She was right about all of that. What she had not entirely accounted for was that Thomas Hale was already there. He had been there for a while, actually, and had been conducting the same internal negotiation she had been conducting. Whether it was right to feel this, whether it was too soon, whether he was sure it was real and not just gratitude, not just the relief of having someone capable and kind in his house and his life again. He had taken these questions out and examined them in the early morning hours when he couldn't sleep, the way he sometimes examined a piece of land he was considering buying, looking at it from different angles, testing the soil, looking for the soft places. And every time he examined it, it held. It was not gratitude. It was not convenience. It was specific to her, to Cecelia Voss with her green eyes and her steady hands, and her way of listening that made you feel the whole world had gone quiet in order to hear you better. It was a Saturday afternoon in late September when he finally said something, and he said it because something happened that made it impossible not to. He had been in the barn working on a piece of harness that needed restitching, and Cecelia had been in the kitchen garden doing the final fall harvest, and she had come around the corner of the barn for a bucket of water from the rain barrel there, not knowing he was on the other side of the barn wall, and he had heard her before he saw her. She was singing something quiet to herself, a simple melody he didn't know, and when she came around the corner and saw him, she stopped. Visibly self-conscious for the first time in all the months he had known her, the flush rising quick and honest in her face. "I didn't know anyone was here," she said. "I know," he said. He was still holding the harness, but he had stopped working on it. "What was that?" "A song my mother used to sing," she said. "It's nothing." "It wasn't nothing," he said. She looked at him, still flushed, slightly uncertain, and that uncertainty on her face, so uncharacteristic, so entirely human, did something to him that the months of watching her be competent and steady and good had been leading to without his having realized it. He put down the harness. He said, "Cecelia, just her name. But the way he said it meant everything else. She looked at him across the short distance between them, the late September light warm and slanting across the yard, Captain asleep in the dust nearby, the distant sound of the children playing somewhere around the front of the house, and she waited with the quality of absolute attention that was so essentially herself. "I have been trying to find the right moment for this for a while," he said, "and I have come to the conclusion that there may not be a right moment, so I am going to say it plainly." He met her eyes. "I have feelings for you that are well beyond what an employer ought to feel for his housekeeper, and I think you know that, and I would like to know if you feel the same way, and if you do, I would like to discuss changing our arrangement to something more permanent." The word permanent hung in the air between them in the September afternoon. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt the particular vulnerability of having said a true thing to someone and waiting to see what they do with it. And then she said, "I have felt the same way for quite some time," and the relief in her voice was the most unguarded thing he had ever heard from her, and it matched exactly the relief in his chest at her answer. And he crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took her hands in his, her strong, capable, flour-dusted hands, and looked at her with the full force of everything he had been keeping carefully managed for months, and she looked back at him with the same force. And the honest relief of 2 people who have finally said the thing they've been carrying was almost like laughter. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been certain of something for a long time and was finally acting on the certainty, and she came forward to meet it with the same certainty, and the September afternoon continued around them. The warm light, the sleeping dog, the sound of Samuel's voice somewhere around the front of the house, demanding that Clara be the one who was it because she was always trying to make him be the one who was it. And the world did not pause for them because the world never does. But they did not need it to. When they broke apart, she was laughing a little, which he had not expected, and the laugh made him laugh too, and it was the first time he had laughed that way freely, fully, without it costing him anything since before Anna died. "I think," she said, still laughing a little, "that we should probably tell the children." "I think we should probably tell Dusthaven," he said, "before Dusthaven tells itself something worse." "We'll have to get married fairly quickly then," she said, and she said it with the same practical directness she brought to everything, as though they were discussing fence posts or the management of the kitchen garden, and he loved her for it so intensely in that moment that he had to look away briefly at the middle distance to compose himself. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "That is a yes," she said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he agreed. They told the children that evening after supper, sitting together in the front room, Thomas and Cecelia on the settle and both children on the rug at their feet, with Captain taking up more than his fair share of the rug as always. Samuel received the news with the slightly stunned expression of someone processing something big and then said, after a moment of visible calculation, "So Cecelia would be our mother." "I would be your stepmother," Cecelia said carefully. "I want to be very clear about that. I am not replacing your mother. I could never do that and I would never try, but I would be part of your family and I would love you both as my own for the rest of my life." Samuel considered this with great seriousness. Then he said, "I think that's fine. I think Mama would think it was fine too." Cecelia pressed her lips together for a moment. "I hope so," she said. Clara, who had been looking at Cecelia during this entire exchange with those thoughtful storm-colored eyes, said, "Are you going to stay forever now?" "Yes," Cecelia said. "I am going to stay forever." Clara climbed up onto the settle beside her and put her head against her arm in the same way she had done that first early morning in the kitchen, and that was that. They were married in October, in the church with the crooked steeple, on a day that was warm and gold in the way that Texas sometimes gifts to the fall, as though apologizing for the summer. Harriet Coombs came, and Walt and Pedro, and several neighboring families, including the Garrity family from the next ranch over whose eldest daughter, Nora, had become something of a friend to Cecelia in the past few months. The preacher was a man named Reverend Bayard, who had been in Dusthaven for 30 years and had married and buried most of the people in it, and he performed the ceremony with the mixture of sincerity and efficiency that was his particular style. Cecelia wore the green wool fabric made up into a dress. She had sewn it herself, with considerable skill, and she carried a bunch of late wildflowers that Clara had assembled at dawn with total artistic commitment and presented to her with a gravity that made Thomas's throat tighten. Samuel had polished his boots until they were a reasonable approximation of presentable, and stood beside his father with the upright posture of someone who understood that this was important and was doing his best to be equal to it. Thomas looked at Cecelia as she came up the aisle of the small church on the arm of Walt, who had been pressed into this service with gruff willingness, and he felt the same certainty he always felt in her presence, larger now, richer, deepened by the months of knowing her, settling into the ground of him like roots. She was beautiful. She had always been beautiful, though it had taken him a while to look at her that way because he had been so focused on watching who she was that the what she looked like part had been, in some sense, secondary. But she was beautiful now and fully, the green of the dress bringing out the green of her eyes, her dark hair pinned with a care she didn't always take with it, her expression having the particular quality she got when she had made a decision she was entirely at peace with. He had chosen well, or perhaps she had chosen him. He thought it was probably both, as most good things are. "I do," she said, when Reverend Byad got to that part, and the way she said it was clear and present and unmistakably hers. "I do," he said, and meant every syllable. The winter of 1878 coming on was a mild one by Texas standards, which meant it was merely cold and occasionally miserable rather than dangerous and unlivable. The ranch work shifted to its winter rhythms. The cattle needed feeding and watching, but the driving work was done, and there was more time in the house, more evenings by the fire, more of the interior domestic life that Cecelia had been building, and that now, with the shift in their relationship, had taken on a different quality. It was warmer, more open, more full of the kind of ease that comes when two people who have been careful around each other are no longer required to be. Thomas was different in the evenings now. Not unrecognizably so, he was still a quiet man, still more likely to sit and watch than to perform. But there was something relaxed in him, some long-held tension released, and he talked more. He talked about the ranch, about his plans for it, about what he thought about the changing cattle economy as the open range gave way to fenced land, about his father who had come to Texas from Tennessee 20 years ago with nothing, and built this ranch from raw ground. He talked about Anna sometimes too, carefully and with appropriate caution at first, and Cecelia listened without jealousy or discomfort because she was a secure enough person to understand that the love he had had for his first wife was not a threat to what he had with her. It was, in some sense, evidence that he knew how to love deeply and faithfully, which was not a small thing in a man. She told him about Missouri, about her parents, about the particular quality of loneliness she had known after her father died, the way a house empties differently when it empties completely. She told him about the decision to respond to his advertisement, which had taken her 2 days of serious thought, and one night of sitting up late reading the thing over and over trying to determine whether it was what it seemed to be or something else. She told him she had known, walking up the road with Samuel and the crackers, that she was going to like this place. She had not known yet that she was going to love it, but she had known she was going to like it, which was, she said, a good enough place to start. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention she had loved in him since early on, and when she told him about the lonely house, he reached across the table and covered her hand with his, which was not a gesture he made easily or often, and which therefore meant considerably more coming from him than it would have from a man who offered it freely. In December, Thomas took her into Dusthaven on a Saturday and walked her into the general store and introduced her to people he knew as his wife with a straightforwardness that silenced most of the remaining gossip, not by addressing it directly, but simply by making it irrelevant. Cecelia shook hands and said the right things and was neither aggressive nor deferential, and the town, as towns do, revised its understanding of the situation and moved on to the next thing. Harriet Coombs told her privately that the green wool dress was extremely becoming, which was the closest Harriet generally came to a compliment, and which Cecelia received graciously. Christmas that year was the first real Christmas the Hale household had had since Anna's death. The year before, Thomas had gotten through it with a grim focus that the children remembered mainly as a sad, quiet time. This year Cecelia made a project of it with the children, a paper chain, a bit of holly from the creek bank, gingerbread that Samuel ate far more of than was good for him before it even reached the table. She found a small pine tree that Thomas brought in from the wood line south of the ranch, and they decorated it with the few glass ornaments that had been Anna's, which Cecelia brought out with care and reverence, not with any awkwardness, and some new ones she had made herself from ribbon and paper. On Christmas morning, Clara came downstairs to find a new set of drawing pencils beside the tree, properly wrapped in brown paper, and she opened them with an expression of such pure disbelieving joy that it looked for a moment like she might cry. And then she immediately sat down on the floor and began drawing, still in her nightgown. Samuel got a jackknife, which he had wanted for the better part of 3 months, and about which Thomas had had serious reservations that Cecelia had talked him through with patient logic, and he carried it around for the rest of the day with the particular gravity of a boy who has been trusted with something real. Thomas gave Cecelia a small silver brooch, modest but beautiful, shaped like a spray of leaves, and she pinned it to her dress immediately and wore it for the rest of the day. And at night when the children were in bed, she sat with him by the fire and she said, "I have not been this happy at Christmas since I was very small." And he pulled her close and said, quietly against her hair, "Neither have I spring came again." A year had passed since Cecelia Voss had stepped off a stagecoach in Dusthaven, Texas, with $23 and a letter of introduction and a travel bonnet Dusty from Missouri. The kitchen garden came back to life with the authority of a garden that has been tended properly for a full cycle now. The tomato stakes were in place, the bean rows were straight, the herbs by the back step were thick and fragrant. The house was genuinely and fully a home, not just structurally but in every texture of it, in the drawings on the wall and Captain on the porch, and the smell of bread on Thursday mornings, and the particular quality of quiet that lives in a house where people are happy. Samuel turned 7 in April and had a birthday supper with a real cake, which was his specific request, and invited Pedro and Walt as the only guests he wanted, which was considered an honor by both men and was treated as such. Clara turned 5 in May and had a birthday party that included Nora Garrity's 2 younger daughters, and a game that involved a great deal of running and shrieking, and the eventual cooperative destruction of a paper game that Cecelia had made. And she went to bed that night so exhausted with happiness that she was asleep before Cecelia even finished the lullaby. In June of 1879, Cecelia realized she was expecting a child. She told Thomas on a Thursday evening after supper, when the children were in bed and they were sitting on the front porch in the warm, early summer night, and she told him simply and directly the way she told him everything, "I believe we are going to have a baby." And he looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through surprise and joy and something deeper and more complex, something that recognized the weight and the wonder of it. And then he took her hand and held it and did not say anything for a while, and the thing he eventually said was not what she might have predicted. He said, "Are you all right? Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am happy about it." "Are you?" "I am more happy than I know how to say," he said. "I am also," he paused. The last time he stopped again. She tightened her hand in his. "I know," she said quietly. Anna had died from complications after Clara's birth. He did not need to explain why the happiness came with a shadow in it. "I know, and I want you to understand that I am healthy and strong and I have every intention of being here for a very long time." "I know that too," he said. "I believe that." and she could hear that he both believed it and was frightened in spite of believing it. And she thought that was the most honest possible response to such news from a man who had learned what loss costs. "We will find a good doctor," she said, "not just the tooth puller." He laughed at that, which was the right response, and the shadow did not lift entirely, but it became manageable, which is all you can ever ask of fear. The summer passed full and warm and good. The ranch was doing well, better than the previous year, partly because of the organizational improvements that Cecelia had quietly introduced to the domestic side of the operation, which had freed up resources and reduced waste, and partly because Thomas had made a good call on a property purchase in the spring. He had more cattle, better fencing on the east section, and a standing arrangement with a buyer in Abilene that gave him a degree of financial predictability he had not had in the early years. Cecelia continued teaching Samuel and now Clara too, who had started her letters and turned out to be even quicker at learning them than her brother had been. And when the town finally hired a schoolteacher in the fall, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Ellison, earnest and prepared and just slightly overwhelmed by Texas, Cecelia made a point of going to introduce herself and offering support, and they formed a useful alliance. Cecelia helped Miss Ellison understand the specific children she was dealing with, and Miss Ellison gave Samuel the formal education that he was now ready for, and that brought him enormous satisfaction as a social experience, since going to school meant seeing his friends 5 days a week. Clara was still a year away from schooling age but was already reading simple primers, which Miss Ellison, when informed of this, declared to be remarkable and a great credit to her teacher, which pleased Cecelia in the private way that genuine praise always does when it comes without expectation. Thomas watched his wife and his children and his ranch, and the shape of the life they had made together through the long arc of that summer, and fall with a sense of gratitude so constant and so large that he was not always sure what to do with it. He was not a man who found expression easy. He had always been better at showing things than saying them, better at the small daily actions that demonstrated love than at the formal verbal declaration of it. But he found, with Cecelia, that he wanted to say it too, because she had taught him, in her gradual and unforced way, that saying things plainly was not a weakness but a kind of courage, and that the people who mattered deserved the courage. He told her he loved her for the first time on an October evening, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, completely without ceremony. She looked up from the account book she had been reviewing. There was a discrepancy in the supply costs from September that she was tracking down, and she looked at him with those green eyes that he had first registered as steady and careful and now could read as easily as weather, and she said, "I love you too, Thomas. I've been waiting for you to say that for a while." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry it took me this long." "Don't be sorry," she said. "You said it when you were ready. That's the right time." And she went back to the account book, which he would have found disconcerting if he didn't know by now that it was the highest possible expression of her character, that she received important things without drama, that she trusted them enough to not need ceremony, that she could say a thing that mattered and return to the thing in front of her because she was secure that the important thing would still be true when she looked up again. He loved her for that, among many other things. Their son was born in February of 1880, which was a cold month and a hard one for a birth, but which went, against Thomas's private and frequently revisited fears, well. The doctor they had found, not the tooth puller but a genuine physician from the town of Comanche, who had been persuaded to attend by a combination of Thomas's advanced preparation and Nora Garrity's insistence, since Nora had used him successfully for her own children, declared mother and child both excellent. And when Cecelia held the baby in the lamp-warm bedroom and looked up at Thomas standing by the bed with an expression she had never seen on his face before, wholly open, wholly present, the full weight of everything he felt about her, and about this new child, and about the second chance that life had given him rising unguarded and unmistakable in his eyes, She felt that this was one of those moments that you carry forever, not because of its drama but because of its completeness. "He looks like you," she said. Thomas looked at the baby, the dark hair, the round face, the small, unremarkable fists. "He looks like a new person," he said. "He doesn't look like anyone yet." "He'll look like you," she said. "I can already tell." They named him James, after Thomas's father who had built the ranch from nothing. And James Arthur Hale came into the household with the force that new babies bring and rearranged everything around him without apology, which was, both his parents privately thought, very much in keeping with the family character. Samuel, now 8, was fascinated by his new half-brother with the intense scientific interest he brought to most things, and spent considerable time studying James as though he were a particularly interesting natural phenomenon. Clara, at 6, handled the transition with the grace that she had always brought to big things. A brief initial uncertainty, quickly resolved into a settled and protective affection that manifested mostly in her sitting as close to Cecelia and the baby as possible during the nursing hours and drawing pictures of him, which she presented to Cecelia with the solemnity of official documents. Spring came back around, the second spring with the garden right and the house full, and the world arranged more or less as it should be. Thomas and Walt extended the south fence, and Thomas bought a good new horse, not for working but for pleasure, a bay mare with a generous temperament that he named, at Cecilia's suggestion, something other than a food item, which had been the previous naming tradition. He named her Alina, which had been Cecilia's mother's name, and Cecelia stood at the fence watching him work with the mare in the yard, and felt the particular sweetness of a gesture that was both small and enormous at once. The summer of 1880 was a good summer on the land. The cattle were healthy, the rains came at reasonable intervals, and the ranch produced with the steady abundance of a well-managed operation. Thomas hired a third ranch hand, a young man from San Antonio named Carlos, who turned out to be gifted with horses in a way that bordered on the uncanny, and the bunkhouse became a small community of its own. Cecelia expanded the kitchen garden and began growing more than the household needed, selling the surplus to Harriet Coombs' store, which Harriet approved of with the particular approval she reserved for practical and mutually beneficial arrangements. She also began, that summer, to run what amounted to an informal domestic school for some of the women on the neighboring ranches who wanted to learn preservation techniques, or better bread making, or the management of a household budget, skills that her own mother had given her and that she had come to understand were not as universal as she had assumed. Thomas came home one August evening to find 4 women in his kitchen with pots and jars, and an atmosphere of focused, productive activity, and he looked at his wife in the middle of it all, directing the operation with her characteristic combination of precision and warmth. And he thought, not for the first time but with fresh clarity, that he had the considerable good fortune to have married a woman who was not only kind but genuinely capable, not only capable but genuinely wise, and that these were not things you could have predicted from an advertisement in the Missouri Gazette, but which were, in the end, everything. He had dinner with the children on the porch that evening while the kitchen was in full operation, and Clara sat beside him and showed him her latest drawings, which had developed into something genuinely remarkable. The horses she drew now were moving, dynamic, full of that quality that distinguishes a drawing that is technically accurate from one that is actually alive. He told her they were beautiful and meant it, and she leaned against his arm and said, "Cecelia says I should practice every day," and he said, "Cecelia is right," and Clara said very simply, "I know. She usually is." And Thomas looked out at the August evening and thought that was as perfect a sentence as he was likely to hear for some time. James, at 6 months, had indeed developed Thomas's eyes and something of Thomas's jaw, though he had Cecilia's temperament, quiet, alert, watchful, given to long periods of focused attention that were remarkable in someone who could not yet sit up independently. Samuel maintained that this made him boring, but Samuel also spent more time than strictly necessary making faces at James to try to get a reaction, which suggested that he did not actually find him boring at all. In the fall of 1880, Thomas did something that he had been considering since the spring. He went to the courthouse in Comanche, the nearest town large enough to have an actual sitting judge, and he filed paperwork that legally established Cecelia as the guardian of Samuel and Clara, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed under Texas law, so that if anything should happen to him, she would not be in the position of fighting anyone for the right to care for his children. He did not tell her he was doing it beforehand. He brought the filed paperwork home and set it on the kitchen table one evening and said, "I should have done this earlier. I don't know why I waited." She read through it carefully the way she read everything. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know I didn't have to," he said. "That's not the same as not needing to be done." She stood up and put her arms around him, which she did not often do in that deliberate way. She was affectionate, but she was also, at base, a private person, and formal declarations of feeling cost her something even now. And she held on for a moment longer than the gesture required, and he held her back without saying anything, because nothing needed to be said. The winter of 1880 going into 1881 was a harder one than the previous year. A cold front that arrived in December stayed longer than welcome, and there were 2 weeks of sustained low temperatures that were unusual even for Texas, and the cattle required constant monitoring and additional feeding from the hay stores they had put up. Thomas and Walt and Pedro and Carlos worked long days through the worst of it, coming in after dark most evenings with the particular exhaustion of cold outdoor work. And Cecelia made sure the house was warm and the food was hot and both children were settled, and the cradle by the kitchen stove where James spent his days was properly draped against the drafts. There was one night in January when a norther hit hard and the temperature dropped sharply, and Thomas came in very late with ice on his coat, and she had been up waiting for him, both because she could not sleep when he wasn't back and because James had been restless all evening, possibly teething. She met him at the door with a towel for his hands and a cup of coffee that she had kept hot, and he stood there in the kitchen doorway thawing out and looking at her with an expression that was very tired and very warm at once, and she thought that this was what marriage was actually, not the ceremony in the church, not the grand romantic moments, but this, the door opening and someone being there on the other side of it, warm and present and yours. "All the cattle accounted for?" she asked. "All of them," he said. "Lost one of the hay bales to the wind, but that's all." "Good," she said. "Sit down and get warm." He sat down, and she sat across from him with her own cup of coffee and James, drowsy now, in the crook of her arm, and they sat at the kitchen table in the January cold, and the lamplight, and neither of them said much because there was nothing that needed saying, and it was one of the most comfortable silences she had ever sat in. Spring arrived in 1881 with the force of something that has been held back and is done being patient. The land came back green and determined, the creek ran full, and the cattle were in good condition after the hard winter, which Thomas counted as a genuine success. He had plans for the ranch that he talked through with Cecelia on Sunday afternoons, an additional section of land to the west that had come available, and that he wanted to acquire if the price was right. The possibility of adding sheep to the operation, which would require a different kind of management, but which the market suggested was sensible. The question of whether to hire a fourth hand or wait and see how the season developed. Cecelia listened and offered her thinking as she always did, and when he asked her directly what she thought about the western section, she said she thought he should buy it, that the land was good and the price was unlikely to improve, and that in 10 years Samuel would be 17 and capable of a serious role in the operation, and having the expanded capacity would matter by then. Thomas looked at her when she said that. "You think about the long term," he said. "Don't you?" she said. "I do," he said. "I just haven't always had someone to think about it with." He bought the western section in April. By summer of 1881, James was walking, lurching, determined, completely unafraid, throwing himself at the furniture and the walls and the general world with the fearless physicality of a child who has never yet been hurt enough to be cautious. He was 14 months old, and he adored his brother and sister with the uncomplicated passion of a small person who has been loved well from the beginning. And Samuel bore his devotion with the long-suffering grace of an older brother who has not yet figured out that he is flattered by it. Clara, now 7, was the best artist in Dusthaven, which was not perhaps the largest field of competition, but she was also, by Miss Ellison's assessment, one of the best students she had ever taught, and she was reading chapter books by herself in the evenings before bed, which she did with the absorbed silence of someone who has found the thing they most needed: a family. That was what Cecelia looked at in the evenings of that second summer. A family, full and various and complete, with all its complications and its joys and its daily ordinary weight. The children who had been hers to love from the beginning, and the child who was specifically hers, and the man who had looked at her that first September evening across a lamp in a storm and said things that were true, and who looked at her still, every day, with the same eyes, grateful and certain, and full of the particular love that only grows stronger for having been tested and continued anyway. Thomas hired Carlos as a permanent ranch hand that fall, with a proper arrangement and a small raise, and Walt announced that he intended to retire to his sister's place in San Antonio in the spring, which was not entirely surprising, but which made Thomas and Cecelia both feel the passage of time in a way that was not unpleasant but was very real. They planned a proper send-off for Walt in May, with a dinner that Cecelia made and half of Dusthaven attended, because Walt had been in Dusthaven as long as most people could remember, and the occasion deserved to be marked. Cecelia found she was expecting again in the late fall of 1881, and this time Thomas received the news with more joy and less fear. Not because the fear was entirely gone, it would never be entirely gone, but because she had proven herself in the way she meant when she said she was healthy and strong, and he trusted that more than he trusted his own anxiety. She had the baby in August of 1882, in the full heat of a Texas summer, and it was a girl this time. A small, dark-haired, already opinionated creature whom Clara named with the authority of the family's resident artist, proposing the name Louise after a character in a book she had loved, and which everyone agreed was excellent. Louise Margaret Hale, the middle name for Clara's beloved cloth doll, whose memory deserved some kind of honor, was born into a household that was fully and completely prepared to love her, and she came in howling and making her presence immediately known, and the doctor said she was perfect, and Cecelia held her in the afternoon light of the bedroom with Thomas sitting on the bed beside her and both of them looking at their daughter, and the world was very large and very full and very good. Samuel, now 10, inspected Louise with the same scientific attention he had given James, and pronounced her louder than James was, which was accurate, and then went back outside to his work, which at 10 included real chores, and which he did with a conscientiousness that Thomas had begun to recognize as the early expression of the person his son was going to be: dependable, steady, quietly proud of a job done right. Clara drew a portrait of Louise at 3 days old that was so accurate and so alive with the particular quality of new babiness: the unfocused eyes, the furrowed fists, the expression of someone who has just arrived from a great distance and is still orienting, that Cecelia framed it and hung it in the bedroom, and Thomas looked at it every morning and marveled quietly at what his daughter had. The years settled around them like water finding its level. Dusthaven grew a little, a new bank, an expanded school, a second doctor who was better with bones than the first, and the ranch grew too, and Thomas Hale's reputation in the county became, quietly and solidly, that of a man who ran a good operation and ran it honestly, which was the reputation he wanted. Cecelia became, equally quietly, a person that women in the county came to for practical advice, and sometimes for the harder kind. She had the quality of listening that invites real telling, and she did not betray confidences, and she did not judge, and people knew both of these things about her after a while. They had their difficulties, as all marriages do. The winter of 1883 was terrible, with a disease moving through the cattle herd that cost them 15% of the stock and a significant portion of the year's profits. There were months when the money was tight in ways that required real management and some sacrifice, and Thomas carried that in his jaw and his silence, and Cecelia met it by tightening the household accounts without complaint and finding ways to supplement from the garden, and from the small informal economy she had built with Harriet Coombs' store. They argued occasionally, the way that two people of strong character and honest temperament argue, fully and directly and without cruelty, and then with resolution, because both of them believed that things should be talked through and decided, and not left to fester in the way that the unspoken always festers. Their marriage was a genuine partnership, not in the sense of equal division of every task, because they lived in 1883 in Texas, and the structures of that world were what they were, but in the deeper sense of two people who moved through their shared life with a fundamental respect for what each of them brought to it, who consulted each other on things that mattered, who treated each other's intelligence and judgment as real and valuable. Cecelia knew this was not universal in the world they lived in. She was aware that the legal structures of the time gave women far less standing than men. She had navigated that reality, had felt the edges of it when Thomas filed the guardianship papers, and said she should have had that standing from the beginning. She was not naive about injustice. She thought about it sometimes, particularly when she was in town, and saw the ways that some other women were spoken over or decided for, and she was grateful for what she had, and also clear-eyed about the fact that what she had depended very much on having married a man who chose to treat her as a full person, which was not a guarantee that anyone should have had to depend on a man's individual choice to provide. These were not comfortable thoughts, but they were honest ones, and she sat with them as she sat with all uncomfortable truths, acknowledging them, not running from them, and then returning to the work of the specific life she was living, which was the only life she could change. By 1884, Samuel was 12 and had begun working the ranch in earnest during summers, learning from Thomas and Carlos with the focused interest of a boy who was discovering that this work was the work he wanted to do. He was good with the cattle and better with the horses, and Thomas spent Saturday mornings riding the perimeter with him and talking through what he was seeing and what it meant, and Cecelia would watch them go out from the kitchen window and feel a satisfaction so deep it was almost structural. It was the satisfaction of a thing built right, of materials good and craft patient, and the result strong enough to stand without apology. Clara was 10 and had a body of work, drawings, sketches, a few oil paintings done on small prepared boards that Thomas had ordered from a supplier in Austin, that was genuine and serious and growing. She had started teaching drawing to a few of the younger children in Dusthaven on Saturday mornings, which she had proposed herself, and which the parents paid a small fee for, which Clara managed with precise accounting, and which Cecelia had quietly helped her establish the terms of, because teaching her daughter that her work had value and deserved fair compensation was the most important domestic education she could imagine giving. James was 4 and Louise was 2, and the house was loud and full and running always a little behind in every direction, and it was the best possible kind of chaos, the kind that comes from too many alive things in the same space, the kind that only exists when there is genuine abundance. Thomas came in from the pasture one evening in October of 1884 and found Cecelia at the kitchen table helping James with his letters. The same table where he had first watched her feed his children. The same kitchen where all the seasons of their life together had been cooked and eaten and talked through. And she looked up when he came in with the same look she always gave him when he came home. The one that he had been the beneficiary of for 6 years now, and which still registered in him as something specific and unearned. Something that came to him not because he had done anything to deserve it, but simply because of who she was and what she felt. "There's Stu," she said. "And James learned the letter M today, which he is very proud of." "The letter M is excellent," Thomas said, sitting down and ruffling James's hair. "What other letters do you know?" James told him in full with the considerable detail that he applied to everything he cared about. Captain, old now and mostly asleep on the porch, lifted his head when Thomas sat down and then put it back down with the satisfied sigh of an elderly dog who has determined that nothing alarming is happening. Louise, in the small chair by the stove that had been made from the one Clara had once sat in, was eating a piece of dried apple with total concentration. The lamp was lit on the table, and the kitchen was warm from the stove, and the evening was settling dark and easy outside the window. And Thomas Hale looked around his kitchen at his wife and his children, all 4 of them, his and hers and theirs together. And he was grateful in the specific and total way that a person is grateful when they know what they almost did not have. He remembered the morning he had read Cecilia's letter of reply to his advertisement. He remembered the skepticism he had carried then, the dim expectation that this arrangement would fail as the others had, that no woman would find sufficient reason to stay in a lonely ranch house with a widower's grief and 2 children and the flat Texas wind. He remembered standing at the fence post and watching her come up the road with Samuel beside her and crackers in her hand, and thinking that she was not what he had expected, without yet knowing what she was. He knew now. He knew exactly what she was, and had known for years, and was still learning new dimensions of it with the ongoing fascination that is the particular gift of loving someone who is, in themselves, worth studying. After supper, when James was in bed and Louise had gone down early from sheer tiredness, and Samuel was doing his reading, and Clara was at her drawing board in the light of the second lamp, Thomas and Cecelia sat together on the front porch in the October dark with their coffee cups. Captain was at their feet. The stars were out in the particular profusion that happens on clear Texas nights, more stars than a person from anywhere else ever expects, thick and silver and unhurried. "I was thinking today," he said, "about the day you got here." "Were you?" she said. "What about it?" "I was thinking that I almost didn't put the advertisement in the paper," he said. "Walt talked me into it. I thought no one would come. Several people probably read it and thought better of it," she said, "just like you predicted." "One person didn't," he said. "No," she said, "one person didn't. The quiet around them was the good quiet of a household that has done its work and earned its rest. Somewhere in the south pasture a cow moved and called once and went still. The stars continued. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said the most important things. She looked at him in the dark, the lamplight coming through the window behind them catching the lines of his face, the familiar lines that she had catalogued over 6 years into something she could not imagine the absence of. "I'm glad I stayed," she said. "This is the life I wanted. I didn't know exactly what it looked like before I got here, but this is it." He took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair and held it, his thumb moving across her knuckles in the unhurried way of a man who has all the time in the world. And they sat together in the October dark while the stars did what stars do and the ranch breathed quietly around them. And the house behind them held their children in sleep, all of them safe and warm and loved. And there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left to worry toward, nothing to fear that was not survivable. There was just this, the particular solidity of a life built by 2 people who chose it together, day by day, in the kitchen and the fields and the long evenings, in the small moments of grace that accumulate over years into something that cannot be taken apart because it has grown too thoroughly together. Clara came to the door a little while later with a drawing in her hand and said, I finished it. Come see. And they both got up and went inside to look at what she had made. And it was a portrait of the house, the front porch, the lamp in the window, the two of them sitting in the chairs in the dark, seen from a slight distance as though from the road, the warm light inside making the house glow against the Texas night. She had drawn it from memory and imagination, from the feeling of what the house was now, and it was the best thing she had ever done. Thomas looked at it for a long time. He said, "That's our house." "That's our home," Clara corrected him. Cecelia put her arm around Clara and looked at the drawing and felt the truth of it moving through her like water moving through good ground, settling into every part of her. The girl from Missouri who had stepped off a stagecoach with $23 and a letter of introduction and found, in the most unlikely and most necessary place, exactly where she was supposed to be. The children who had needed someone to sit with them, and the man who had not known how to ask for what he needed, and the life they had all made together in this house on the Texas plain, where the wind came across the grass, and the stars were always more plentiful than you expected. She hung the drawing by the door that night, where everyone who came into the house would see it first, and it stayed there for the rest of their lives.